Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Matt Segall. Matt is an assistant professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, or CIIS, where he teaches courses on process philosophy and German Idealism. He received his doctoral degree from CIIS in 2016, and his dissertation was published as The Physics of the World Soul. It offers a synthesis of the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and the work of the German Idealist philosopher Friedrich Schelling. He also blogs regularly at footnotesToPlato.com and has a YouTube channel by the same name. Today, we talk about the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Matt Segall. Matt, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here, James.
So maybe we can begin with, since you're a professor of philosophy, what philosophy kind of means to you?
Philosophy for me has always been, more than just a profession. I'm really grateful and honestly quite surprised that I get paid to do this, but for me, it's a way of life and really a spiritual practice. It's a way of orienting myself as best I can manage to the good, to the true, and to the beautiful. I consider myself in a multi-millennial lineage with going back to Plato. And, for me, it's the Platonic dialogues remain the best exemplification of what philosophy ought to be. And so it's not so much about finding answers as it is asking the right questions and maintaining a sense of wonder in the face of reality, in the face of human existence, including death. One of my favorite lines from all of the Platonic dialogues is in the Phaedo, when Socrates is about to drink the hemlock, and he defines philosophy as preparation for dying. And so I think that is the proper way to understand what the philosophical enterprise is really all about. It's supposed to help us cope with and find meaning in our human existence, despite the fact that we know there is this threshold of death beyond which we don't know what happens. It could be the end, it could be the beginning of something else. And so that's how I see philosophy.
Right. And one of the philosophers we're going to be talking about today, who I think has had a big influence on you, is Alfred North Whitehead, whose arguably most famous quote was about the history of Western philosophy being a series of footnotes to Plato, which also is your your handle online for footnotes to Plato. So I assume, do you think that there's some truth to that claim?
Yeah, I mean, he says it's the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition. So it's a little less grandiose than just all philosophy, But I think it's accurate. Plato, in his dialogues, does, through his characters, offer various doctrines, we might say, the famous theory of forms and anamnesis and so on. But also in Plato's dialogues are most of the best critiques of those doctrines. And so as Jung said of himself and as Marx said of himself, I think Plato also would have said that he was not a Platonist. He wasn't putting forward a system. He was putting forward a speculative method, let's say. And Whitehead certainly inherits and expands that method, in light of modern culture, modern science, and modern conceptions of religion and so forth. So
right.
That's an accurate statement.
Yeah, I've had a really fun time listening to a lot of your lectures in preparation for this. And in one of them, you're talking about, I think it was Whitehead was arguing that you can split philosophers into the kind of speculative explorer types who are pushing things forward, or the kind of critical skeptics who are more, so you've got the kind of speculative types and the critical types, and you were arguing that, you can map those onto basic kind of orientations of if you're acting out of fear and, fear of being wrong versus kind of exploration, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And Whitehead would be on the speculative side, I guess?
Definitely on the speculative side. another way of getting at this distinction is to repeat a comment that Whitehead reportedly made to Russell. I think Russell reports this in his autobiography, where Whitehead said, "Bertie, you think the world is what it looks like in fine weather at noonday. I think the world is what it looks like when I've just woken up from sleep at dawn, when the halo of dreams are still with us and the distinctions between objects are still kind of hazy." And so, Whitehead is philosophizing from this sort of in-between space, this liminal consciousness, whereas someone like Russell wanted the clarity and distinctness of shadowless light, from which to launch his philosophical inquiries. So different modes of thought, different mentalities. Yeah.
Right. And before we dive into the kind of modes of thought of other philosophers, I'm interested in just what your picture of reality is and the place of consciousness within it.
Well, consciousness is a big word. And so depending on how we define it, I might want to offer, a more expansive conception of its place in nature, or a more limited conception. If consciousness is the sort of rational, egoic, sort of linguistic mode of consciousness that we typically think of, modern human beings possessing, I think that is somewhat peripheral in the universe. I think it requires highly evolved brain, but also very sophisticated social and cultural support structures, language, and all of this. And so I would want to distinguish, as Whitehead does, between experience and consciousness. So not all experience is conscious. And I think there are gradations of experience or feeling, you could say, that that is pervasive in nature. Whitehead he didn't call himself a panpsychist. That's the term that gets used often nowadays in philosophy of mind. It's becoming more widely accepted, at least as something worth thinking about. It's not as easy to just dismiss and brush off anymore, largely thanks to the work of Philip Goff, who's been making the case for panpsychism for several years now. Whitehead's often termed a pan-experientialist, though, which is a subtle distinction. He's not trying to say that psyche or soul, which usually we think of as related to like personality and whatnot, he's not saying that goes all the way down. He's saying this more basic form of experience, this experiential capacity to inherit a past and anticipate a future, even if we're just talking about, a very simple, like almost just a reiteration of what has occurred in the past. For Whitehead, that process of inheriting the past, anticipating the future, that is experiential. And he thinks there is no better way to define what we mean by causality other than by this sort of a transfer of feeling from one moment to the next. And so consciousness might not go all the way down, but experience in this sense, I think, does.
Right. I mean, as we go forward, I'll always use consciousness just to mean the same thing as experience or feeling, or, so I use it in that, I guess you could say, that minimal sense, where there's a distinction between things either have some inner life or inner world or inner, the lights being on, I find a useful kind of metaphor. But So speaking about kind of metaphysics or ontology, Whitehead seems to have this kind of process ontology. Do you share that kind of predilection?
Yeah, certainly. It's, I think, process ontology, or sometimes it's called process relational ontology, is, I think, more accurate especially when you start to consider, 20th century physics, quantum and relativity theories, complexity theory, biological evolution, and the organic world, and symbiosis, and the ways that there are really no sharp boundaries in nature. Everything's flowing into and out of everything else, and that it actually can mislead us to try to force fit hermetically sealed, to force fit nature into these hermetically sealed categories or disciplinary boundaries and so on. And so, yes, I've found process relational philosophy to be applicable across so many different domains, whether it's human society, human psychology, or the way that quarks interact to give rise to subatomic particles, protons and neutrons, and or anything in between. And so, I found it a very helpful, useful, insightful way of thinking about the world.
Right. Yeah, I share the same feelings. And I mean, for anyone who's not sure what we mean by this, I guess for me, the idea of substances, the idea of thinking, what matter is, and it's a kind of, an understandable concrete thing, that's never seemed right to me. As soon as you get down to kind of 20th century physics, it seems that the image of little building blocks goes out the window, right? And so it seems safer to say there's some flux, there's something happening, there's some change, some process. We may not be able to say what it's made of, but something is happening. And the relational component, right? I think, again, I've heard you say that it's to take ecology as the kind of deepest principle of reality, right? So if you're dealing with even with subatomic particles, you need to understand them as you can't, quantum mechanics shows us you can't just understand one particle, right, in isolation. You need to consider everything else. So everything has this kind of this interdependent origination in the kind of Buddhist sense, right? It's a whole. I guess existence is a whole, an interdependent thing that hangs together as a framework, right, rather than being made up of divisible separate bits.
Right. And so in a process relational ontology, an individual is constituted by its relationships to other individuals. And so Whitehead's technical term for this is internal relationships. Everything is internally related to everything else, meaning you can't just remove something from its network of relationships and expect it to remain the same thing that it was, nor will all the other entities in its network remain what they were. Everything is knitted together in this way that, as Whitehead puts it, any local agitation shakes the whole universe. It might be subtle on the other side of the universe, but there's still an influence. And so it's a profoundly interconnected view, and this Buddhist notion of dependent co-origination is basically exactly what Whitehead was talking about, and he makes reference to that in Process and Reality.
Right. And then with this kind of holistic view, right, he also talks about kind of the universe being like an organism, right? This kind of organismic cosmology. Is that related to this view?
Yeah. So he calls his philosophy the philosophy of organism or organic realism, and he's trying to replace the mechanistic metaphor with an organic metaphor or root image, you might say, for understanding what nature is. He thinks that the old mechanistic metaphor that was so important for the founding of science in the 17th century, by the 20th century, he thinks that it had become entirely obsolete, scientifically inadequate as a metaphor. And so he develops this organic view where, for him, organism becomes a category that he wants to generalize beyond just the biological realm. Nowadays, we could say that it's any self-organizing system is an organism. And so atoms are self-organizing systems. They are emergent from the relationships among their components. Protons, neutrons, and electrons are, for Whitehead, akin to the organelles in a biological cell. Right. He thinks that there's an organic analogy that runs from top to bottom throughout the natural world.
Right. It's maybe worth, I guess, saying as well, right, that did he start out as a mathematician and then a quantum physicist and then gradually moved to philosophy?
Yeah, he starts out as a mathematician. He taught mathematics at Cambridge for 20 years and collaborated with Bertrand Russell on the Principia Mathematica. trying to ground arithmetic and logic. That project didn't work out so well. This was in the mid-19 teens. Right around that time, Einstein was developing his special and general theories of relativity. Whitehead had also been very interested in how space and space-time can be mathematized and understood geometrically. Actually, there was supposed to be a fourth volume of Principia Mathematica on space, but after Einstein's special and general theories came out, Whitehead realized that, the whole arena had been totally, reconfigured. And so that fourth volume of Principia never came out, but Whitehead was lured into physics, the physics of relativity and quantum theory, and gradually he made his way into metaphysics because he realized how far reaching these paradigm shifts in physics were. He thought that relativity and quantum theory really demanded, again, a new metaphysics, a new root image of what nature was. He thought that it no longer made any sense to refer to mechanism in the context of a world governed by quantum effects.
Right. Yeah. And then, so both he and Russell were kind of panpsychists, pan-experientialists, right? And it seems that Russell has been revived by people like Philip Goff, but they seem to have chosen him rather than Whitehead. Do you have a sense of why that is?
I'm not really sure. I mean, Russell develops something more along the lines of neutral monism, I think is how he would refer to it. And why is that? I really don't know. Whitehead's philosophy is difficult. Russell wasn't trying to totally, construct a new metaphysical background for contemporary science. Russell was more in the spirit of, analytic philosophy for most of the last century, trying to work with the concepts that scientists were using, rather than to reinvent, to invent a new language to describe the ultimate nature of reality. And so I guess you need to accept more novel premises in order to take Whitehead's view seriously, whereas Russell's more working within existing paradigms. And also, Whitehead ends up developing a process theology, and for many academic philosophers, that made his philosophy easier to dismiss or to ignore, because they thought that it was based in some kind of religious belief. Though if you read Whitehead, he's very clear that his is a metaphysician's God, not unlike Aristotle's God, and he really has little patience for most of the religious views of the divine as some sort of special being set apart from other beings that needs to be constantly paid metaphysical compliments. So yeah, I think those are some of the reasons, but it's a mystery to me. And I've asked Philip Goff about this, and I know he has students who are interested in Whitehead, but he hasn't yet written about Whitehead's panpsychism. So
right.
I'm not sure really.
Is there also a kind of metaphysical difference between Whitehead and Russell, where, because people in the Russellian tradition seem to talk a lot more about kind of substances, like maybe matter is the substance, and they have all aspects of matter. Sorry, every instance of matter has kind of mental properties, and I think I find generally people like to think in terms of substances. I'm very substance phobic, and so I see Whitehead's metaphysics. To me, it resonates as something more deeper and really getting to grips with what quantum mechanics kind of suggests about the nature of reality. I wonder if that's if it's an easier way in with Russell.
Yeah, I mean, Whitehead's critical of the substance property ontology, and he sees it as related to subject predicate logic. And so, in other words, the substance way of thinking is interwoven with our very mode of speaking about the world. the grammar of our language. Russell was also critical of substance predicate logic, and so they have that similarity. But and Russell also understood physics to be, and Goff makes this point also, describing the relational aspects of the physical world and not the intrinsic aspects. But the way that Russell's approach has been inherited does, I think, overemphasize this substance property mode of thinking, in that, as you're saying, consciousness or experience is imagined as the intrinsic property of a substance. And this is, I think, just as foreign to Whitehead's mode of thought as materialism is. They might both be panpsychist, but to imagine the psyche or the consciousness as a property of a substance is very foreign to Whitehead's way of thinking about this.
Right. And maybe you could lay out how Whitehead sees matter and mind relating in his framework.
Yeah. So, when Whitehead looks at modern philosophy, he's critical of the abstract way in which matter and mind have been conceived. In some sense, matter is among the most abstract ideas that the human mind has ever invented. No one's ever seen matter or felt matter. We see form, right? We don't see matter. Matter is supposed to be the underlying substance out of which various forms are composed, right? So rather than thinking in these abstract categories, Whitehead wants to reimagine reality in a process relational way, where, if you want, what we call matter is really already actualized facts that accumulate in the past, and what we call mind are the as yet unactualized possibilities that we can anticipate in the future. And so each present moment or occasion of experience in Whitehead's scheme, and for Whitehead, if we ask what is the universe made of, it's made of actual occasions of experience. And all of the enduring objects around us are sort of streams of occasions of experience that inherit characteristics from one another in a stable way, right? So this is not an actual occasion, my coffee mug. It's a stream of actual occasions that are reiterating a pattern. And so in terms of what mind and matter are in this scheme, matter, again, would be the habits of the past that are repeated, and they seem solid and fixed. But in Whitehead's scheme, they're not as solid and fixed as they may at first appear, because every occasion of experience is also opening to a realm of possibilities and trying to realize the most relevant possibilities for its situation. So in light of the past, what are the possibilities afforded for the future? In the case of a coffee mug, there's not as much capacity to realize novel possibilities. But in the case of an organism like a single cell, a bacterial cell, or certainly a human being, we have greater capacity to consider and realize possibilities. In other words, our mental capacity is more intense, in that we're not just determined by the habits of the past, right? And so depending on the complexity of the system you're talking about, this polarity between mind and matter, or this polarity between inheriting the habits of the past and anticipating novel possibilities in the future, depending on the complexity of the system, there's more capacity to dip into these future possibilities and realize them so as to alter the past.
Right. And so is it fair to say that in Whitehead's view, reality is kind of a process that's where you have possibilities kind of collapsing into actualities? You've got a whole range of things that could happen, and then they become actual events. And then we put the label matter on the things in the past that we can observe and say, well, they're actual, right? And what we call consciousness or experience is this forward-facing, I guess, what's the right word to use? Just the opening into potentiality on the other side of this direction, this flow.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting. It makes me think of, I mean, in this view, then everything, right, has some level of experience, hence pan-experientialism. But it makes me think of, in kind of neuroscience of consciousness, a few people like Anil Seth and Carl Friston have emphasized this idea of counterfactual depth in the emergence of consciousness. So they're kind of arguing that when brains develop to a certain point in evolution where they can really simulate multiple possibilities of the future counterfactually, it's not just a reflexive loop, but there's some real depth, and they can kind of plan that is the key thing that kind of leads to the emergence of consciousness. I don't agree that it emerges that late in nervous systems. I think it happens with biology, but I think there's an interesting parallel there, right, where there's something here about that ability of kind of looking into the unknown and being able to simulate it in both of these schools of thought, it seems.
Yeah, no, I think this predictive processing paradigm in the neurosciences is on the right track. I think, as you're saying, there might be some metaphysical differences in terms of when most neuroscientists would say consciousness emerges. And, Whitehead would agree that the brain is necessary for human consciousness, but that there, as David Chalmers has famously laid it out, the hard problem of consciousness is, in fact, an impossible problem in the way that it is typically framed, where it's imagined that whether it's before the first living cell emerged or before the first nervous system developed, that somehow the universe was completely devoid of any interiority or experience, or the light was just off. I think emergence is a helpful concept when we're talking about gradations of complexity, but I don't think emergence can do the work of bringing this entirely novel ontological domain into existence, right? Consciousness, out of something that completely lacked it. There's a lot of hand waving that goes on around this. And I think, Whitehead is really taking this problem seriously, and seriously enough to totally revise the materialist paradigm that creates the problem. If the problem can't be solved within the materialist paradigm, you need to come up with a new metaphysical scheme wherein the problem doesn't arise, right? And that's what pan-experientialism is trying to offer.
Right. Yeah. In my way of thinking, there's there is that kind of black and white. The lights are entirely off, and then they're entirely on. Although I think I take a kind of biopsychist perspective, where I think the emergence of life is the thing that could, and it's a kind of a strongly emergent view where I think this novel thing really does come into existence. Although I guess the way that I don't think of it as a kind of a new ontological category so much as just an activity. I think maybe it was you were talking about Whitehead, but in something in one of the lectures you were talking about this idea of consciousness as activity rather than as a substance. And I think to me that's really crucial.
Yeah, I think biopsychism makes a lot more sense than the idea that you need a certain number of neural connections before consciousness comes on or something. I mean, this gets discussed in terms of like basal cognition, and it's very clear that single cells are making decisions. They have preferences, they're taking action in light of environmental conditions that, if that's not consciousness, I don't know how else we would be able to point to it. And so I think biopsychism is a respectable position, but it still leaves open this question as to physics and chemistry. And, in some ways, abiogenesis, or, the origin of life, is no less difficult a problem than the origin of consciousness. And so, we could talk about that. Very interested in that type of research. What is it about physical and chemical activity that allows life to arise out of it? What are the preconditions? And when you start to think through that, I am at least led towards some kind of pan-experientialist ontology, but I understand why it can seem like a bit of a stretch when you first consider it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that makes me not a panpsychist or a pan-experientialist, I think, is the way it's often marketed as a kind of intellectual position is appealing to some sense of, well, you can't get something new without having some without having the same properties in the kind of the constituent parts, which I just don't buy. You know, it's the idea of saying, you know, H2O molecules have to have some level of wetness because you couldn't possibly have this new property coming into existence. I understand that, you know, subjectivity, you know, the fact of taking a perspective on the world is a different, it feels like a different kind of thing to something like, you know, the dynamics of water that is a kind of objective phenomenon. But I do think then we see genuine emergence. And so I'm not, when I think of consciousness as an activity or something that can be instantiated in a system, I don't have that anxiety of needing it to be, you know, in the individual atoms or subatomic particles. But I don't get the impression that that's the reason that you ascribe to this view.
Yeah, I mean, rather than saying, so again, this would be the difference between a substance property panpsychism and a process relational panpsychism, rather than saying an atom has consciousness,
right,
as if it were the property of a substance. I think in a process relational ontology, we would, the consciousness is in the relationship, right? And it's a mode of relationship among entities, which again are themselves constituted by those relationships. And so is an atom conscious? No. But what is it that allows energy to forge relationships that endure through time? And for Whitehead, you know, this abstract, it might seem abstract, this just basic conception of togetherness. How can anything be together with anything else? And, you know, Whitehead's argument is that there is no other definition of togetherness other than experiential togetherness. So again, experience here is more in the relationship than it is a property of a substance. And it's kind of a gestalt shift in a way, but it applies also at the human level. You know, if you imagine a human being as an infant being dropped off on an island and somehow able to get its food and water needs met, the idea here would be that it would not be conscious in anything like, not that it wouldn't have some kind of experience, but it wouldn't be conscious in anything like the way a normal human being is, and after certain thresholds are passed, could never be rehabilitated because of the way that development works, right? And so what makes a human being conscious in the way that we're used to understanding consciousness is fully a relationally emergent thing. It has to do with how we're socialized, right? How we internalize the gaze of others. And initially, the first other is the mother. And so I think we neglect typically the extent to which even our own form of very complex consciousness is entirely dependent on relationships to others, right? We don't gain a sense of I unless we are loved by a mother and sort of given a sense of self, not only by the mother, but mother, father, community, you know, culture. And so I think when we try to understand the experiential capacity of simpler systems, even below the level of single cells, we have to also think of it in these profoundly relational terms.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because it seems, you know, any conscious system, you know, especially if you think of it as an activity, it's conscious by being an embodied system in an environment. At least is how I think about it. And it seems modern neuroscience is kind of beset by this insistence of kind of conscious brains that exist in isolation, that if you plug in the right inputs, it can live in the matrix, and they kind of forgetting that brain exists as part of an integrated biological system. I mean, yeah, it seems it's kind of by virtue of being a neuroscientist in my career that I was disabused of the idea that the brain is what's important for consciousness, because I think you were kind of pointing to this earlier, that when you realize the brain is just more meat, it's just more of the same biological stuff, it's made of cells, same DNA, there's really nothing magical or special about it. And it's really not even a separate thing, like once you think of it, so deeply, the nervous system is so deeply interwoven into the organism, it's kind of an illusion to draw a line around the brain and say, well, that is the consciousness, secreting organ of the body. I mean, I know I'm preaching to the converted, probably with you, but yeah, it seems to be very pervasive, this way of thinking. I wonder if, there's also a lot of kind of philosophy bashing goes on as well. Do you think, is that frustrating for you, that there seems to be a lot of, arrogance in the kind of neuroscientific area, that we don't need the philosophers, but at the same time, there's a lot of bad philosophy being thrown around?
I'm used to it, I guess, at this point, whether it's the physicists who are bashing philosophy or the neuroscientists. Philosophy, I think, is easy for scientists to belittle because it's so speculative. And, as a philosopher, I am deeply interested in the sciences, all of them. And I really depend upon the specialized knowledge of scientists and their ability to communicate that knowledge to non-specialists in order for me as a philosopher to make sense of the big picture. And, so I'm really interested in philosophical cosmology, which is different than physical cosmology, in that I'm trying to also, in developing a cosmological picture of the whole universe, not only describe the physical goings on, but the biological, the psychological, the sociological, and perhaps even the spiritual, and so I try to respect scientists and their work. However, when I do detect scientists who are making metaphysical claims and not realizing it, I'm going to criticize those metaphysical claims. And that's not the same as criticizing science. Whitehead says every respectable scientist is supposed to say that they don't like metaphysics, but what they mean is they don't like having their metaphysics criticized. And so from Whitehead's point of view, metaphysics is not like something extra that you do when you finished physics. It's more about the basement level presuppositions that, yeah, maybe you need an established physics to even ask those questions, but it's not as though you could have physics or biology or psychology without the metaphysical background, the basement foundation that provides, the categories in terms of which you're defining the physical, the biological, the psychological, and so on. So metaphysics is not optional. What's optional is whether we do them explicitly or just are unconscious of the metaphysical assumptions that we're making. And so, a lot of this is about the way that universities have become so different departments, so siloed that, often scientists don't learn any philosophy. They don't know the history of philosophy. They don't even know the history of their own discipline often. They just learn from the latest textbook. And I get it, because knowledge has become so specialized, and there's, within biology, there's, who knows how 50, 100 different subdisciplines, and they can't even talk to each other, much less, to the physicists or whatever. So a lot of this has to do with the fragmentation of knowledge production in contemporary universities. I don't really blame the scientists for that, but I do hope that philosophy can play this role of trying to establish interdisciplinary links so that we can stitch the universe back together, as it were. So that's a lot of the work that I'm trying to do.
Right. And on that point, between kind of physical and philosophical cosmology, with a kind of, some physicists have argued that time doesn't exist, for example. And to me, as someone who has a kind of process orientation, I might agree that time in a kind of linear sense of something that actually stretches into the future and the past doesn't exist. But to me, process or change or, some flux seems to be the most fundamental thing. Is that something, does that pose a challenge for this view, do you think? What's your take on that?
Well, to dismiss time because it doesn't fit into one's favored physical model, I think is to, in a way, do violence. It's to do violence to one's own epistemological presuppositions. And what I mean by that is, as physicists, we can't neglect the fact that we live in a universe that was capable of producing us as knowers, right? And so whatever else we say about the universe, if our model of the universe makes it seem impossible that we could have emerged as knowers in order to make those claims, this is where the metaphysical contradictions come in and that need to be surfaced by some, philosophical inquiry. And so nothing is more fundamental to human experience than the flow of time. It's fundamental, right? We're born, we age, we die, right? You don't go from winter to fall to summer to spring. Time has a direction, and that directionality is inescapable for our conscious experience, right? It's a presupposition of our freedom, of our ability to act. Like, we can't change the past, but we can influence the future. The very thought process that a scientist goes through to develop their models presupposes the directionality of time, right? And so I think that it is a performative self-contradiction to deny that time has any reality, because if you do that, you're undermining the epistemological basis upon which you could make the claim, right? And so this is kind of a transcendental argument, in the sense that I think there are certain preconditions for knowledge as such to be possible. And if we start making claims about reality that stand in conflict with those presuppositions, there's some philosophical confusion here that needs to be worked out. So I agree in the model of general relativity. It doesn't matter what direction time goes. There's, it's often called the block universe, right? This four-dimensional block, and the future exists out there somewhere already. And our perception of the direction of time is, as Einstein put it, a stubbornly persistent illusion. In the context of the model, yeah, that's true, but it's a model, right? Someone came up with that model. And so this is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness that, if people haven't heard of Whitehead for any other reason, they've probably seen this fallacy cited in some book. And it's the danger of mistaking the model for the reality. And I think that's what's going on when time and the directionality, the flow of time is denied. It's misplaced concreteness.
Right. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Very well said. And you mentioned earlier on that Whitehead also includes a kind of theological aspect to his worldview. Is it, I think I heard you say in a lecture that he considers kind of creativity to be the kind of most foundational principle rather than some divinity or God, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, creativity is his ultimate. God is the first creature of creativity. The initial conditioning, creativity is impossible to characterize because it is everything. You could say, I was describing mind and matter, trying to translate them into Whitehead's scheme, but you could also say that Whitehead replaces matter with creativity, right, as the basis of reality, and God is the first creature of creativity that sets some limit upon the pure potentiality of creativity, which is sort of it's like the initial conditions that allows an actual world to emerge out of the quantum void, you could say. And so God for Whitehead becomes this principle of limitation or sometimes he says a principle of concretion. It's his explanation for why there is something actual, and rather than there being nothing, or in other words, mere possibility that never actualized. Because creativity in and of itself is akin to chaos, right? And so where did order come from? Whitehead admits that, his divine function, if we want to think of it in like a mathematical way, is totally irrational because it provides the very ground for rationality. We're able to make sense of the universe because there's this principle of limitation that filters what would otherwise be chaotic possibility, right? And so, again, it's a metaphysician's God. He doesn't deny that like religious emotion and belief and ritual and all this could not arise as a result of this idea of God, but it's an idea, it's a concept. It's not an object of religious devotion primarily.
Right. And so, yeah, you have this kind of metaphysical God, I guess, in a similar way to kind of Spinoza seeing God as equivalent to nature and this kind of pantheism, right, of God being immanent in nature. But I've also heard you say that there's a differentiation between pantheist and panentheist. Would you consider Whitehead?
Yeah, I think he's a panentheist rather than a pantheist, in the sense that, in Spinoza's pantheism, it's quite similar to Einstein's view, actually. Einstein said he was influenced by Spinoza in that, God or nature is this whole, and all of the parts within that whole are in some way, they have less reality than the whole, and each part is necessarily determined by its relationships to all the other parts. I know this is sounding a little bit like Whitehead, but I'll explain the difference. Spinoza's imagining the entirety of the universe as in some ways already actualized. And for Spinoza, the philosopher, through the intellectual love of God, is kind of falling in love with their fate and recognizing that you as an individual don't have freedom to change the necessary structure of reality, but you do have the freedom to accept it, right? And so it's this conception of reality as this eternal whole. Not that different from Whitehead's scheme. However, Whitehead is bringing in this dimension of creativity and unrealized potential, in the sense that the universe is not a finished whole. It is a process of becoming. He says nature is essentially incomplete. It's always passing beyond itself. And so in that sort of a scheme, God plays the role of the kind of the provoker of novel experience. And so God is Whitehead uses the term eros, this Greek term for like desire. There's this divine eros that is compelling the settled facts to overflow themselves and to bring forth novel configurations, and to his term ingress novel possibilities. And so it's the difference between a finished eternal whole, a conception of the universe or of God as a finished eternal whole, and a universe that's in process, and a divine being that is in process, growing with the world as it continues to advance into novelty. And so Spinoza is still imagining the universe in terms of substance, right? And so if you transform substance into process, you end up with something quite similar to Spinoza's view, but that is really emphasizing the incompleteness of this unfolding universe, right? It's always passing beyond itself. And so the divine, in this sense, is, Whitehead's God, unlike, this is what's very heretical and unorthodox about his theology, is that as a process theology, he's imagining God as, in some sense, capable of growth, capable of change, capable of being affected by what happens in the world. whereas most theisms imagine God as unmoved by anything that happens in the world, totally transcendent, whereas Whitehead's preserving some sense of transcendence, but also Whitehead says, the world transcends God just as much as God transcends the world. And that transcendence has to do more with the transcendence of settled fact and this advance into novelty. It's not transcendence in the sense of God existing in some separate realm.
Right. And on that kind of core idea of the move into novelty, I find that the idea of the potentialities becoming actualities and situating consciousness there, I find it aesthetically really appealing. I find it very elegant, and it feels to me like it came out of the mind of a mathematician, someone who's really finding this very elegant idea. Mm-hmm. And I personally, again, I tend to, when I look at self-organizing systems in of the form that life takes, I find a lot of things fall into place for me when I think about kind of things having kind of purpose or meaning. All of that makes sense when it's anchored to self-organization, which is part of why I'm on that side. But it seems like with Whitehead, there's a lot of these attributes that I guess a critic might suggest that there's some anthropomorphizing of the physical universe. Do you think that's a characterization of, is there goal directedness at the level of physics?
So anthropomorphism is a criticism of Whitehead that I have heard. It's a criticism of panpsychism. But I would also want to be careful to avoid mechanomorphizing, which is a subset of anthropomorphism in the sense that human beings make machines, right? A machine implies a mechanic or an engineer who designed the machine. And so the anthropomorphism charge applies just as much, if not more so, to the mechanistic conception of nature as it does to a panpsychist conception of nature. And on the other hand, as I was getting at before, we live in a universe that clearly is capable of producing us. So the universe itself, in some sense, is anthropomorphic. It has given rise to human beings. And so can we say then that the universe has an aim toward something like anthropic organisms? Well, the way that some physicists would want to get around this is they would say, well, yeah, but there are infinitely many other universes that we will never have access to that have totally different fundamental constants and laws of physics. And there's no life, there's no consciousness in those other universes. We just happen to be in that 1 in a million, 1 in a trillion universe that gave rise to us. And as a speculative maneuver, I can't, deny that as a possibility, but it doesn't seem very scientific to me. It's impossible to test empirically. It seems more like a desperate attempt to preserve some sense of this old scientific paradigm where everything is really matter in motion, and anything more complex than that arises through sheer chance and is extremely unlikely. I would rather deal with the universe that we actually have access to, that we can actually study and observe. And in this context, seems pretty clear to me, difficult to deny, that there is an arc to the evolution of the cosmos toward complexity. I would be very surprised if there are not many other living planets in our galaxy and in the rest of the universe. And I would be surprised if there are not among those living planets, some subset of which that are that have produced intelligent life. Now, will those intelligent species be like us? I don't know. I mean, we don't really know we have nothing to compare ourselves to. But I think if we had 1 or 2 other examples of intelligent life, we might be able to see some similarities, whether that has to do with, encephalization and like the growth of a brain on one side of the body and the development of eyes. I mean, on Earth, maybe you know about this phenomenon of convergent evolution. Right. Eyes, for example, evolved independently dozens, 40 times, I think, along different lineages, right? And so if that's the case here, it seems that maybe this might take place on other planets as well. After all, it's the same periodic table of elements, the same chemistry. And so I do think that if we bracket this multiverse idea, which again is, it's bad metaphysics, it's not science, it's bad metaphysics. If we bracket that and focus on this universe and the patterns that we see unfolding here, I do think that there is aim, and this doesn't have to be in conflict with entropy, because more contemporary understandings of thermodynamics show how complexity, in a way, is maximizing entropy. Just depends on what scale you're looking at, and so I think there is an aim to evolution. I don't think it's deterministic. I think there's plenty of chance and kind of evolutionary groping and trial and error. But over the long term, I think it's hard to deny this tendency or this tilt toward complexification.
And you signaled earlier that part of the work you're doing is kind of, I guess, almost doing healing work when it comes to our worldview, right? I think you signal towards some, I guess, maybe alienation from the universe. And do you think that Whitehead's picture is a way to make us realize that we really are at home in the universe?
Yeah, I think so. As opposed to imagining ourselves as improbable accidents, if we see ourselves as the leading edge of a multi-billion-year process of evolution, and that we, in a sense, owe our capacities to the struggles of ancestors, and that we then have a responsibility to future generations because the decisions we make in the present will affect how this arc continues. And so I think, it does afford us the possibility of a kind of a worldview wherein we're not accidents, but we are participants in a cosmological process. And I think we're at an inflection point in our species' history and in the history of the Earth where, whether or not we wake up to this possibility will have significant consequences, not only for us, but for the rest of the community of life on this planet. And so in industrial growth society is, I think, driven by this profound sense of alienation and this deep fear of death and denial of death. And I think this anxiety, this alienation, and this fear is driving unbelievably destructive, mode of life, not only for us again, but also for the rest of the community of life on this planet. And so I think it is really, we're in an emergency situation here, and it is a faulty worldview that is causing the emergency. And so I think we're in desperate need of a different cosmological vision that does allow us to feel at home. And, I think biopsychism gets us a lot of the way there. If we can feel that sense of kinship with the rest of the biosphere, that might be good enough. We don't need to take it all the way to quarks and photons and whatnot. Although I think if we got to biopsychism as a widespread, as widespread and accepted as, a sense of our kinship with the rest of life, might not take too much more, pushing to get people to accept the entire universe as much a mental and psychic event as a physical and material one.
Right. Yeah. It's really, I think there's loads of interesting stuff we could explore in this area, but I won't take up another hour of your time with that. But I think a lot of the kind of picture you were saying before of maybe the conventional scientific picture of us as being perhaps kind of epiphenomenal, the universe isn't really about us. I carry a lot of that thinking, but I'm very open to the idea that a lot of it might just be conditioning. But the thing is, I also feel that we are completely at home in the universe, and I guess for me, I guess non-attachment is an important principle. That the universe might be absurd and it might be scary in some ways, and it may not be a cozy, familiar place in all of its aspects, but we are an aspect of it. We are a part of it, and the part of our mind that is freaked out by that doesn't have to run riot, which it does in industrial society, as you say. I think it's the kind of scared primate that's freaking out, that wants to build more and more and destroy the earth underneath our feet to survive. Like, that isn't really what we are. If you really cut through those levels of your psychology, you can get to a place of, I guess, more liberation from that psychological freedom, rather than necessarily feeling kinship with cold, distant parts of our galaxy. But I do think, the kinship, as you said, kinship with the kind of the community of living things on Earth really would get us a long way to or perhaps all the way towards getting us out of the situation we're in. Because we're not the problem at the moment isn't that we're mining asteroids and, other kind of inanimate objects that we think might be, you might argue could be sentient. But having that ecological sense of self where you see nature as like you, which it obviously is, it still astounds me the extent to which people still in science seem to not genuinely believe that we are a product of nature. In talking about biopsychism, people may say things like, well, could nature be conscious? And you have a human who's evolved out of nature saying this to you, who believes itself to be conscious, and it's, well, of course it can. It's staring you in the face, and you have the same shared common ancestors as plants, and to me it just seems self-evident. But we're up to an hour. I don't know if maybe we should wrap up, but I'd want to give you a chance to come in there if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to overly romanticize the natural world, whether we're talking about the evolutionary process of life on Earth or the larger universe. Creativity is often a very destructive process. Like heavier elements are created by dying stars, and that's a good example of the role that death plays in cosmic creativity. You might not think stars are alive, so they're not really dying when they go supernova. But if we take Whitehead's organic realism seriously, the analogy, the metaphor would hold, even in astrophysics. But if we just look at life on Earth, without death, evolution cannot occur, and I think that there's more to the story than just natural selection. I think there are other evolutionary dynamics at play, but I think, the anthropologist Ernest Becker wrote this book on death denial, and the denial of death was the name of the book. And it, from his point of view, drives so much of our culture, not just industrial culture, but, pre-modern and primal cultures as well. And I don't know that I would go so far as to say that all culture is a form of denial of death. But culture is an attempt to reconcile ourselves to the fact that we are going to die. And it's an attempt to find meaning in the continuity of life beyond death. Even if it's not our personal immortality, there is various other forms of immortality that we can imagine. And I think seeing consciousness or experience as pervasive, at least in the biological world, is one avenue to imagining ways in which, I have my individual life, but I also participate in the life of the species, and in that way I will live on in others, right? And so I think if we cannot think of death as the annihilation of everything that's important and meaningful, but instead this portal to a form of transcendent meaning and continued existence. It might not be me as I identify myself in this body in this lifetime, but nonetheless, there's a deeper form of continuity of life, and that we can make contributions to the species. We can consider 7 generations hence, what will my decision, how will my decisions impact my ancestors, or my offspring, let's say, or the future beings who will inherit this earth. And so I think there's a whole ethics that flows out of a different metaphysical understanding of our status as conscious beings.
Right. Yeah, I definitely think that expanded sense of self, death can go from this monolithic endpoint into just a phase in a process, right? As you say, with that, it's necessary to have the destruction, to have new ingression of novelty and complexity, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks so much, Matt. I've really enjoyed this. Where would you send people to if they want to look into your work more?
I would say to my blog, footnotes to plato.com. It's numeral 2. I have a lot of writing, and I post my YouTube videos there and whatnot. So that'd be a good place to find my work.
Great. Yeah. And hopefully we can do this again one day, because we only covered about a quarter of the material I was hoping I'd get to talk to you about. But,
yeah, I'd love to do a part 2.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Cool. Thanks, James.